Every scandal has a backstory, and every conviction a conspiracy.
Look at this document. We are opening the file on a timeline that spans continents. It is a timeline written in redacted legal dockets, buried environmental casualty reports, and the quiet, calculated movement of billions of dollars.
Picture the exact moment the rot was first exposed in these sources. It wasn't some dramatic raid by federal agents under the cover of darkness.
No, it was a sterile, bureaucratic moment in Singapore.
Imagine a heavy stack of legal dockets hitting a polished mahogany desk. A $21.3 million lawsuit filed by a boutique consulting firm called Rasfish.
And the target of this lawsuit, an ESG darling, a supposed technological savior of global food security named Pure Salmon.
That specific lawsuit in Singapore is the thread. Once you pull it, an entire global corporate architecture begins to unravel.
Right.
You are looking at the vault on the financialization of global protein. We have aggregated the evidence right here in front of us.
Department of Justice press releases, Securities and Exchange Commission enforcement actions, international court dockets.
Leaked internal company communications, and granular environmental casualty reports.
Our mission today is methodical. We are going to trace the blood trail of a toxic Wall Street banking culture, a culture that mutated and rebranded itself under the impenetrable, righteous shield of sustainable green aquaculture.
They engineered a massive illusion to trap billions in institutional capital.
We need to clearly define the players in this dossier before we dig into the mechanisms of their operation. At the center is 8F Asset Management, a private equity vehicle.
Then its flagship project, Pure Salmon, which promised to completely revolutionize how the entire world consumes protein.
And finally, their technological partner, AquaMaof, the engineers tasked with making that grand illusion physical.
Understand the gravity of what you were looking at here. This isn't just a localized story about fish farm.
No, it's an autopsy of the crime of power. It is about systemic, calculated corruption.
It is the story of how the exact same architects who engineered the 2008 global financial collapse learned from their exposure.
They didn't go to prison, they didn't reform, they adapted. They learned exactly how to weaponize environmentalism.
To understand how they adapted, we have to isolate their original DNA. We have to follow the capital back to the source.
That leads us directly into the lineage of 8F Asset Management, which brings us to the darkest, most aggressively scrutinized era of Deutsche Bank.
The founders of 8F Asset Management are Stefan Feruz and Martin Fothergill. Let's be explicitly clear here. These men are not marine biologists.
Right. They are not environmental scientists who spent their lives studying oceanic ecosystems.
They emerged from the absolute highest echelons of Deutsche Bank. Feruz served on the board of Deutsche Bank's alternative investment portfolio, overseeing $50 billion in assets.
And Fothergill was the global head of multi-asset products. They operated at the apex of the bank during a period defined by federal regulators as a culture of extreme greed, mania, and institutional egoism.
I have the Department of Justice files right here. Let's look at the baseline environment they inhabited, because it dictates everything they did next.
Right. During their tenure, Deutsche Bank was hit with a $7.2 billion settlement for residential mortgage-backed securities fraud, the infamous RMBS scandal.
Let's break down how that actually worked, because the mechanics are crucial. The bank was taking toxic, fundamentally worthless home mortgages from borrowers who could never pay them back.
They were packaging thousands of these bad loans together, securitizing them, slapping a top-tier rating on them.
And selling them to unsuspecting pension funds and institutional investors.
Exactly. All while the bank's own internal traders were secretly taking out insurance policies, betting against those exact same securities, knowing they would fail.
It is the definition of institutional sociopathy. Explain to me how a massive, highly regulated bank decides to sell a financial product it explicitly knows is toxic.
Well, I'm looking at the DOJ documents from 2006 and 2007, and they are explicit. By May 2007, Deutsche Bank knew there was a massive trend of overvalued properties.
I am reading directly from an internal Deutsche Bank communication captured by federal investigators. An employee states, quote, "We are finding ourselves going back quite often and clearing large numbers of loans to bring down the deletion percentages."
They knew the underlying home appraisals were artificially inflated. They knew the paper they were pushing was fraudulent.
But they processed them anyway because the bank received favorable pricing on the fraudulent loans.
They openly admitted in writing that they would tolerate misrepresentation as long as the buying continued.
They tolerated it because the structural incentive demanded it. And that RMBS fraud was just the domestic mortgage market. Let's open the file on the LIBOR manipulation.
The London Interbank Offered Rate. For those who aren't familiar, LIBOR isn't just some obscure banking metric.
No, it was the fundamental benchmark interest rate tied to trillions of dollars in derivatives, corporate loans, and everyday household mortgages globally.
It was the heartbeat of the global financial system, and Deutsche Bank's London subsidiary pleaded guilty to wire fraud and paid a $2.5 billion penalty for manipulating that rate.
We have the conviction records of top Deutsche Bank traders like Matthew Connolly and Gavin Black.
The sheer casualness of the LIBOR fraud is what makes it so chilling.
I have the electronic chat logs right here. Listen to this exchange from March 22, 2005. It's between a Deutsche Bank US dollar LIBOR submitter and a trader in New York.
Go ahead, read it.
Quote, if you need something in particular in the LIBORs, i.e. you have an interest in a high or a low fix, let me know, and there's a high chance I'll be able to go in a different level. Just give me a shout the day before or send an email from your BlackBerry first thing, end quote.
A global economic pillar determining the interest rates for millions of people, manipulated via a casual BlackBerry message just to pad a single trader's daily position.
A microscopic shift in that rate meant millions of dollars in illicit profit for the bank.
According to investigative reports compiled by state agencies and extensive analysis by publications like Der Spiegel, this was not the work of a few rogue bad apple traders.
No, this was a culture of organized irresponsibility, instituted from the very top under the leadership of figures like Joseph Ackerman and Anshu Jain.
Stop on that phrase, organized irresponsibility. How exactly do you structure a multinational trillion-dollar bank so that the executives at the top can extract tens of millions in personal bonuses while maintaining total plausible deniability when the federal indictments inevitably come down?
How does the architecture of that protection actually function?
You engineer it through structural obfuscation. Think of it like a Russian nesting doll of corporate liability. The center doll is holding a lit match in a room full of gasoline, but the outermost dolls have all the fire insurance.
Right. Ackerman took over as CEO in 2002. He systematically downsized the official, legally liable management board.
In its place, he created a shadow entity called the Group Executive Committee, or GEC. By arguing that the GEC members were not legally acting as company directors, the bank deliberately bypassed regulatory oversight from BaFin.
The German Financial Supervisory Authority.
Exactly. Because of this legal loophole, BaFin abstained from even checking the qualifications of the GEC members.
This created an impenetrable labyrinth of committees and subcommittees beneath the GEC.
When the DOJ or the SEC finally came knocking to investigate the rot, the architecture of the bank was so convoluted that nobody could legally prove who had ultimate responsibility for what. The liability was diffused into nothingness.
And within that shadow structure, the corruption didn't just fester. It became a global operational standard. Look at the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act settlement.
A $130 million penalty. Deutsche Bank was operating an elaborate systemic bribery scheme involving what they politely called business development consultants, or BDCs.
Operating in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi.
The term BDC was nothing more than a sanitized corporate euphemism for a bribe conduit. These were shell entities used to funnel money to foreign officials to secure lucrative state deals.
The DOJ files show Deutsche Bank employees openly discussing the absolute necessity of paying a Saudi BDC, which happened to be a company owned by the wife of a key client decision-maker, to incentivize her husband.
The internal memo is stark. It reads, the client and the BDC are intimately linked, and any cessation of payment will certainly prompt a significant outflow of business.
They paid another Abu Dhabi BDC over $3 million without generating a single invoice. Fully aware the individual lacked any financial qualifications other than his blood relationship with the target client.
Let's pull back and look at the sheer scale of the DOJ settlements we just laid out. $7.2 billion for the RMBS mortgage fraud.
$2.5 billion for the LIBOR manipulation.
$130 million for FCPA bribery violations.
If the architecture of this fraud was so undeniable, so explicitly documented in chat logs and internal memos detailing payoffs and fake appraisals, how is it possible that the operators at the top of these divisions walk away?
That's the core question.
They walk away with their capital intact, their reputations laundered, ready to start brand new private equity funds. Is the entire global financial system designed to brutally punish the corporate entity while perfectly protecting the architects who built the bombs?
The historical record suggests exactly that. The billion-dollar fines are ultimately paid by the shareholders. The penalties are quietly absorbed on the balance sheet as the sheer cost of doing business.
Literally categorized under operational risks and litigation.
The executives who presided over this era of psycho-terror management, where short-term explosive profit was extracted at the absolute cost of long-term viability and legality, rarely face personal criminal liability.
They exit the burning building. They take their extracted wealth, their high-level sovereign networks, and most importantly, their operational playbooks.
Which is exactly what happened here. A corporate culture rooted in market manipulation, wire fraud, and the systemic evasion of accountability doesn't just evaporate when an executive updates their LinkedIn profile.
No, it simply finds a new, less regulated vehicle to inhabit. When the subprime mortgage grift inevitably collapsed in 2008 and the regulatory heat on traditional banking became suffocating, these players needed a new narrative.
They needed a bulletproof shield to continue operating. They found that shield in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
They seamlessly transitioned from the radioactive ashes of Deutsche Bank's reputation to the birth of a new empire, ADF Asset Management.
Let's examine the pitch they used to build this empire. ADF Asset Management launched its flagship project, Pure Salmon, with a massive, highly capitalized promise.
They claimed to the world that they were going to produce 260,000 tons of Atlantic salmon annually. Not in the ocean, but in land-based recirculating aquaculture systems known as RAS.
Spread across a network of global facilities. The marketing facade they constructed was utterly impenetrable. They utilized the pristine, utopian imagery of clean salmon.
They promised zero ocean emissions, zero microplastics, zero antibiotics, and absolute ecological harmony.
But we must deconstruct how this specific language functions in modern institutional finance. The terminology of social impact and global climate salvation is not just public relations boilerplate.
It is a highly specialized key. It is designed specifically to unlock sovereign wealth funds and institutional capital that are legally mandated to meet ESG, environmental, social, and governance investment quotas.
So basically, they're using the Save the Oceans branding to suck up billions of dollars from massive investors while making it incredibly difficult to see where that money is actually going.
And the strategy yielded massive capital aggregation. The documents in the vault show a $120 million investment secured from the Brunei Ministry of Finance and Economy's Strategic Development Capital Fund.
They effectively sold the Sultan of Brunei on a beautiful, utopian 3D rendering of a high-tech fish farm.
But we must compare this beautiful rendering to the broader, darker trend of asset management obfuscation.
The SEC has been executing a severe, ongoing crackdown on investment advisors who utilize complex fund structures to deliberately hide their true operational mechanics and conflicts of interest.
Look at the 2023 enforcement actions for context. The SEC charged BlackRock's Randy Robertson for failing to disclose a massive conflict of interest regarding a film distribution investment.
An investment that was directly tied to advancing his own daughter's acting career.
They also penalized Classic Asset Management and an executive named Douglas Schmitz for breaching their fiduciary duties.
How?
By trapping client funds in highly leveraged, dangerous ETF.
While demonstrating a complete misunderstanding of the fundamental catastrophic risk of the products they were selling.
The pattern is identical. It's obfuscation. ESG investing has rapidly become the perfect dark pool for high-risk, low-transparency capital aggregation.
A dark pool is traditionally a private exchange for trading securities that is not accessible to the investing public, allowing massive trades to happen in secret. ESG operates similarly.
The more righteous and globally critical the cause appears on paper, the less rigorous scrutiny the underlying financials receive.
I mean, who is going to meticulously audit the biological viability of a complex water filtration system when the glossy brochures are stamped with official UN sustainability badges?
Precisely. The branding provides immunity from scrutiny. You juxtapose the righteous, planet-saving rhetoric of 8F against the grim reality of their offshore corporate structures.
When you dig into the filings, you find silent partners like the Swiss investment firm KL1 operating in the deep background.
You find a labyrinth of holding companies and subsidiaries perfectly designed to aggregate and extract management fees long before a single fish is ever brought to market.
You look at this Brunei deal, 120 million locked up based on a utopian rendering of a fish farm.
Is this a legitimate industrial ambition? Or is this just a highly evolved mechanism designed strictly to capture and hold management fees, while the underlying physical asset remains a phantom?
To answer whether the asset was a phantom or a reality, we cannot look at their marketing materials. We have to look at the paper trail of how they treated the very people who brought them the money.
That brings us back to that heavy docket sitting on the desk in Singapore, the Rasfish litigation. Let's look at the ethical discontinuity here.
Elaine Wiseman and Michael Rubin operated a Singapore-based consulting firm called Rasfish. They were hired as the fixers.
They were contracted to secure sovereign capital for ADF. According to the sworn legal filings, Rasfish is the exact entity that delivered the massive $120 million Brunei investment.
They provided the crucial access to the Ministry of Finance, and the moment that capital was secured, the trap was sprung.
The court documents allege a calculated, brutal, and immediate betrayal. 8F secretly approached Michael Rubin to work for them directly and exclusively.
This was a blatant, undeniable violation of the written non-compete and non-solicitation contract between ADF and Rasfish, which explicitly forbade ADF from poaching Rubin.
Rubin accepted the offer. ADF then unilaterally canceled the Rasfish contract entirely.
And the killing blow. They flatly refused to pay the millions in commissions owed on the capital that Rasfish had already successfully secured.
This is the exact Wolf of Wall Street cutthroat culture we just mapped at Deutsche Bank, manifesting in real time in the aquaculture space.
Cut out the middleman the second the capital is locked in the vault. Evade the contractual obligation. Destroy the partner.
Rasfish is now suing them for $21.3 million. The language used in the litigation docket is severe. It details formal claims of disreputable business conduct.
It alleges a total and complete lack of commercial morality. Rasfish states on the record that it is their duty to bring ADF's predatory practices to light,
claiming that Pure Salmon and its sovereign investors have been left literally high and dry.
Look at the mechanics of this conflict. A binding written contract is completely ignored. A key partner is aggressively poached. The massive commission is withheld.
Compare this directly to the DOJ evidence of Deutsche Bank, using proxies and shell consultants to move money and evade compliance. It is the exact same operational muscle memory.
The implications for ADF's fiduciary narrative are absolutely devastating. If an asset management firm is willing to ruthlessly breach legal contracts with their own capital raisers, the people who brought them to the dance, what does that indicate about their transparency with the sovereign wealth funds whose billions they currently hold?
If they will readily defraud the finder, will they defraud the sovereign?
Hold on, let's play devil's advocate and look at the tactical intelligence of the players here. Why risk the reputation of the entire global operation over a commission payout?
They are promising 260,000 tons of fish. That's a massive multi-billion-dollar scale.
Right.
In the grand scheme of that kind of global rollout, $20 million is a rounding error.
Are you telling me they're willing to blow up their entire reputation, invite a highly public lawsuit in Singapore, and risk the Brunei relationship just to save $20 million?
That makes no logical sense. Does this point to extreme executive hubris, or is it a glaring signal of acute, hidden liquidity distress within ADF?
Why fight a bloody public battle over a finder's fee if the empire is actually flush with cash?
It almost certainly signals extreme, hidden distress. When capital becomes restricted, when the operational reality begins to collapse, entities immediately default to their baseline behaviors.
They hoard cash, they burn partners. The operational distress wasn't just hidden in the boardroom negotiations over unpaid fees, it was already bleeding out onto the factory floor.
The cutting-edge technology they promised the Sultan of Brunei simply didn't exist in the way they claimed.
Which opens up the technological fracture, the rot inside AquaMaof. Remember, ADF and Pure Salmon did not build the complex recirculating aquaculture system technology themselves.
They were entirely dependent on an Israeli technology vendor named AquaMaof. In December 2021, that foundational partnership violently fractured.
They publicly called it a divorce. We must treat this divorce as a critical piece of forensic evidence. Why did the tech partner fail?
Let's look at the true fiscal reality of the partner ADF chose to build its global empire. In July 2025, AquaMaof filed a desperate petition in the Israeli Central District Court.
A 190 million shekel debt settlement with its creditors. That is approximately $56.8 million in debt they could not service.
A total financial collapse of the engineering core. But the documents in our vault reveal this wasn't just an issue of over-leveraged balance sheets or macroeconomic headwinds.
It was a complete cultural collapse. The institutional fragility of AquaMaof is heavily documented in leaked internal communications and verified employee testimonies.
We have extensive accounts detailing a deeply toxic, paranoid leadership structure. Employees described executive management as rabid egomaniacs.
But the true, terrifying indicator of the rot was their organized manipulation of public perception. Management actively forced their own engineers and employees to sit at their desks under direct supervision to write and submit fake positive reviews on employment platforms like Glassdoor.
I'm looking at the archived Reddit and Glassdoor testimonies right now. The absurdity of it is staggering. Quote, "My work would randomly assign employees to write positive reviews based on a script that was delivered to them. It was so glaringly obvious on the site that the reviews were fake."
When an employee eventually left and attempted to post a legitimate, critical review warning others about the dysfunction, the company immediately threatened ruinous legal action.
They handed out small severance packages entirely bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements to systematically silence the defectors.
Think about the execution gap here. The gap between a beautiful 3D rendered model in a pitch deck presented to a sultan and a functioning, highly complex biological facility.
If the foundational technology underlying Pure Salmon's 260,000-ton global empire is engineered by a deeply indebted, culturally toxic company that literally expends its resources forcing its own engineers to falsify employment reviews, the entire industrial ambition is structurally doomed.
That execution gap is unbridgeable under those conditions.
Let's ground this. We are looking at an industrial project requiring microscopic, relentless, 247 precision to keep millions of biological organisms alive in an artificial environment.
You are dealing with volatile biofiltration, vital oxygenation, and constant ammonia removal.
If the leadership is so deeply toxic and paranoid that they are faking employment reviews just to manipulate their corporate image, what are they faking on the engineering safety reports?
What data are they massaging on the water toxicity levels? Does a corrupt culture inevitably manufacture a corrupt, failing product?
Yes, because in a corrupt corporate culture, the absolute priority is always the suppression of bad news rather than the resolution of the underlying engineering flaw.
The manager who flags the failing biofilter is fired. The manager who hides it gets a bonus.
We don't have to guess what happens when corrupt engineering meets biology. We have the casualty reports.
Let's examine the biological reality. This is the physical crime scene. We shift now from financial filings and court dockets to the actual environmental fallout.
We must look at the broader landscape of land-based salmon farming to understand the inherent catastrophic volatility of the asset class 8F was aggressively selling to sovereign wealth funds.
Look at their major competitor, Atlantic Sapphire. The data is incredibly grim. They experienced a mass mortality event where 800,000 salmon died prematurely in their Miami facility.
The stated cause in their corporate filings, a vague design weakness in the filtration system.
Let's explain how this happens, because it's not like a software glitch where you just reboot a server. Explain the biology of a recirculating aquaculture system.
In a natural river, when a fish eats and excretes ammonia, the current simply washes it away. In an indoor RAS facility, it is a completely closed loop. You are trapped with the waste.
To survive, the system relies on a massive biofilter, a delicate ecosystem of millions of living bacteria designed to eat the toxic ammonia and convert it into safer nitrates.
If there is a minor power fluctuation or a sudden change in temperature or an engineering flaw in the water flow, those beneficial bacteria die off instantly.
And when the bacteria die, the ammonia spikes.
Exactly. The ammonia levels become highly toxic in a matter of minutes. The fish cannot breathe.
800,000 biological organisms effectively suffocating in their own concentrated waste inside a concrete tank. And that is just one incident.
Atlantic Sapphire also suffered a massive, unexplained fire that completely incinerated their Denmark facility, sending their stock price plunging.
In Norway, another competitor experienced a catastrophic incident involving suspected hydrogen sulfide poisoning that rapidly killed 32,000 cod.
This is a bloodbath.
It is the inevitable, violent clash between the relentless demand for short-term corporate yield and the unforgiving reality of biological mechanics.
The financialization of global protein demands rapid exponential scaling. You have to show explosive growth to justify the massive management fees and the inflated private equity valuations.
But RAS technology is profoundly volatile. It is intensely capital heavy, what we call capex heavy. It requires massive upfront infrastructure costs and is prone to sudden, catastrophic failure.
You simply cannot apply a Silicon Valley software growth model to millions of living, breathing biological organisms. But that is exactly what the banking architects of 8F attempted to do.
And it isn't just the fish dying. The local ecosystems and the human communities surrounding these mega facilities are bearing the brunt of this financial experiment.
Let's look at the grassroots resistance. The documents show the total humiliating abandonment of the pure salmon project in France.
They attempted to bulldoze their way into building a massive facility in Redon-sur-Mer, but they were met with fierce, organized local protests by environmental groups like Systemic and Estuaire 2050.
The activist groups didn't buy the UN sustainability badges. They accurately framed the project as a concrete jungle, threatening fragile local ecosystems, explicitly prioritizing the greed of transnational corporations over the inhabitants of the estuary.
And how did 8F and Pure Salmon respond to this legitimate community concern? Did they engage in dialogue?
No, they defaulted to their Wall Street baseline.
Right.
Legal aggression. They filed ruinous defamation lawsuits against the local environmentalists.
They used SLAPP tactics, strategic lawsuits against public participation. They used their massive capital advantage to try and bludgeon the local, underfunded resistance into silence in the courts.
But it backfired. Both of those defamation lawsuits completely failed. And because they failed, the corporate veil was pierced.
Pure Salmon was forced into a mandatory public inquiry, scheduled for December 2025, to formally address the severe hidden risks regarding water resource depletion and toxic waste management.
This is a deeply entrenched historical playbook for the aquaculture industry. We must bring in the global context to show this isn't an isolated incident in France.
Look at the ongoing investigations into the industry in Chile. Transnational corporations, operating in dark connivance with the government, literally utilize the Chilean Navy to violently suppress local fishermen, like the Sea Defense Front in Mahun.
They attempted to force through a highly toxic waste duct for the Selco pulp firm by submitting heavily redacted environmental impact assessments based on entirely false, fabricated data.
They split indigenous communities through organized campaigns of threats and bribery. The industrial exploitation of coastal and water resources consistently, predictably prioritizes corporate greed over local ecosystems.
Aggressively utilizing state force or endless legal warfare to silence any opposition.
When we step back and look at the whole board, 800,000 dead fish suffocating in Miami, the hydrogen sulfide poisonings in Norway,
The failed bullying defamation suits in France.
Yeah.
The historical state-backed corruption in Chile. We have to ask a fundamental question about the asset itself.
Is this an industry merely experiencing early growing pains as it scales up? Or is land-based megafarming an inherently fundamentally flawed model that only survives by consuming relentless, endless rounds of speculative capital from investors who don't understand the biology?
The forensic evidence overwhelmingly points to a fundamentally flawed model. It is sustained not by physical production, but by a continuous, highly managed narrative of future potential.
But the illusion is shattering. The ecosystem is actively rejecting the infrastructure, the local communities are rejecting the corporations, and now, finally, the regulators are closing in on the money.
Let's map the fallout. The institutional risks surrounding 8F asset management are compounding rapidly, closing in from multiple jurisdictions.
We have the recent regulatory touches documented in the files. On October 30, 2024, the Abu Dhabi Global Market Financial Services Regulatory Authority, the ADGM FSRA, issued a formal CRS penalty notice against 8F.
For regulatory contraventions regarding systemic transparency failures, a transparency failure penalty in the Middle East, the exact same region where they secured their massive Brunei capital.
That is not a coincidence. And the dragnet is widening fast in Asia. By early 2026, both the Monetary Authority of Singapore and the Malaysian Securities Commission issued severe public alerts regarding 8F and Pure Salmon,
explicitly citing clone entities and fraudulent apps operating under their banner.
These alerts are critical indicators. They indicate a firm that has completely lost control of its corporate identity and its operational security, creating a heightened severe risk for retail investor confusion and total brand destruction.
We must explain what this means in the broader landscape of corporate accountability. It perfectly parallels the recent PennyMac class action investigation.
Explain the PennyMac parallel. That's the Bleichmar-Fonte and Ald LLP investigation into PennyMac Financial Services.
Correct. PennyMac is currently cornered by investigators for allegedly failing to disclose material operational risks to their shareholders. They aggressively touted the massive success of their mortgage recapture efforts to investors.
Deliberately misrepresenting their actual dismal success rates as macro interest rates wildly fluctuated, they sold a narrative that contradicted the operational reality.
8F Asset Management is exhibiting the exact same fatal symptoms of securities risk. They are failing to disclose the massive material disconnect between their high-level ESG marketing the utopian promise of global sustainability and hundreds of thousands of tons of production and their granular stalled, failing execution on the ground.
The ultimate, undeniable tell of this deep economic distress is the quiet downgrade of their physical operational ambitions.
The documents in the vault reveal the transition of Project Jonah in America. It was originally promised and capitalized as a massive revolutionary salmon powerhouse.
It has now been quietly, embarrassingly reduced to a mere trout farm. The empire is rapidly shrinking.
The map of their global operations is no longer a map of revolution. It is a mosaic of failure. Stalled mega projects, unexplained geological mishaps.
A discarded technology vendor drowning in Israeli debt court. A sultan's $120 million investment trapped in illiquid limbo.
And a deeply paranoid leadership structure that views aggressive legal action against its own partners and local communities as standard operating procedure.
Look at what we have assembled here. We have clone alerts in Singapore, transparency penalties in Abu Dhabi, an abandoned strategy in Europe.
And a multi-million-dollar lawsuit over unpaid commissions with the very people who found them the money.
In a world where the Department of Justice can extract $7.2 billion from a bank for systemic fraud, but leave the executives walking free to start new funds, what does the endgame actually look like for a boutique asset manager when the music finally stops?
Who is left holding the bag when the beautiful 3D rendering fails to materialize into reality?
The victims are always the same. The sovereign wealth funds whose capital is locked in failing infrastructure.
The local municipalities that offered massive tax incentives based on false promises of employment.
And the fragile ecological environments permanently disturbed by the initial abandoned construction. The architects of the scheme, historically, simply extract their exorbitant management fees, legally dissolve the entity, and walk away into the shadows.
This brings us to the final reckoning. Let's summarize the overarching conspiracy we've pulled from the hole today.
The architects of Deutsche Bank's most corrupt era, the era of RMBS fraud, LIBOR manipulation, and proxy bribery, did not reform.
They simply learned to dress their high-risk, transparency-averse financial instruments in the bulletproof vest of sustainability. They weaponized the language of the climate crisis.
They used the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a Trojan horse to extract sovereign wealth, built a collapsing house of cards on toxic engineering, and violently betrayed the very partners who brought them the capital.
It is the ultimate perfected evolution of the financial heist. The crime is no longer committed in the dark boardroom. It is committed in broad daylight, under the righteous banner of saving the world.
Which leaves us with a chilling, unanswered question to mull over as we look at the future. Direct your attention to a document filed in Bordeaux, France, dated April 18, 2024.
It details a public meeting regarding a new mega project called EME. It is a proposed massive battery factory on the Gratakina port terminal.
It claims once again to be a net zero project that will save the world, this time by processing critical metals for the electric vehicle revolution.
It demands massive public funding, explicit financial guarantees from the French state, and severe environmental compromises.
Including operating as a highly dangerous Seveso-classified site, handling massive quantities of toxic nickel and cobalt salts right on the water.
And if you trace the capital flow, who is one of the primary financial partners deeply involved in this EME battery project?
KL1. The exact same Swiss investment firm operating as the silent offshore partner for 8F Asset Management and Pure Salmon.
If the sustainable protein market was this easily thoroughly manipulated by financial engineers with dark pasts, if a simple 3D rendering of a fish farm can extract $120 million from a sovereign wealth fund, while the founders fight over the stolen commissions in a Singapore court.
What happens when these exact same players inevitably turn their sights to the multi-trillion-dollar green energy transition and critical mineral supply chains?
Are we actually saving the planet, or are we just blindly financing the next great corporate heist?
The files remain open, but the patterns of power do not lie.
Close the file and the deep dive.